κάποιος έδωσε τη δυνατότητα στην Κίνα, όπως είπατε, να κλέψει την τεχνολογία. Και είδαμε ότι το τελευταίο διάστημα, για να εξισορροπήσει την κατάσταση η Ουάσιγκτον, στρέφεται προς την Ινδία, που είναι μια κίνηση. Η Ινδία είναι μια χώρα που έχει ομοιότητες με την Κίνα, είναι πιο δημοκρατική, δεν διοικείται από ένα κομμουνιστικό κόμμα όπως στην Κίνα, είναι πιο δημοκρατική, είναι μια μεγάλη χώρα, έχει μεγάλη έφεση στις τεχνολογίες ο Ινδικός λαός και στα μαθηματικά και στην υψηλή τεχνολογία. Προφανώς εκεί οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής θα βρουν ένα αντίβαρο. Πόσο πιθανόν είναι να γίνει ένα δεύτερο λάθος με την Ινδία, όπως κατά την άποψή μου έγινε κάποιο λάθος και στη σχέση με την Κίνα, για να μετατραπεί η Κίνα από μια χώρα με φτωχή τεχνολογία, τώρα να είναι πλούσια σε τεχνολογία και να ανταγωνίζεται και να απειλεί όχι μόνο τα οικονομικά συμφέροντα των ΗΠΑ, αλλά και την εθνική ασφάλεια των ΗΠΑ με αυτήν την υψηλή τεχνολογία που διαθέτει. Τι σημαίνει λοιπόν το άνοιγμα των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών προς την Ινδία κατά την άποψή σας?
Πολύ σοβαρή ερώτηση αυτή, κύριε Σάβα. Let me say first of all that one of the greatest strategic errors on the part of United States foreign policy has been the deliberate uplifting of China, our number one potential threat, going back to the 1980s and 1990s, to become a competitor of the United States. And it's difficult to find any time in recent human or diplomatic history a time when the greatest power in the world facilitated the rise of its greatest adversary, which is what we've done in the United States, especially since 2001, when the United States welcomed China into the World Trade Organization, and then China began to engage in intellectual property theft, in sabotage, in coerced technology transfers, and a whole host of measures, so that to this day, the FBI director in Washington has testified in Congress that China is stealing about $600 billion worth of intellectual property from the United States every year. So we have to face up to our own errors in the United States, in Washington, and this is bipartisan, Republican and Democratic, from the Clinton administrations to the current administration. So when it comes to India, you raise a very important distinction here, Kirisav, and I want to emphasize this. And that is that India is the world's largest democracy. And it's not, I would say, that it's more democratic than China. China has zero democracy. There is no democracy. It's a dictatorship of the Communist Party. Remember, there's a genocide taking place in Western China. There are 2 million people in concentration camps. We haven't spoken about a phenomenon like this since the Holocaust of World War II. So the human rights abuses in China are monstrous, and they're disgusting to humanity. India is an imperfect democracy, but it's a democracy. And so when the Chinese government comes to the Greek people and says, we have our shared ancient civilizational values, that's a lie. They're not just ancient. One is democratic, Greece, and the other one is totalitarian and dictatorial, China. And India is democratic. It is in the family of democratic nations, however far they have to go to improve their democracy, because there are terrible, terrible human rights abuses in India as well. But you raise a very important point, Mr. Savas, and that is that India is not going to ever become a junior partner of the United States, or an ally of the United States. It is a great civilization itself, dating back 4,000 years. It now has a greater population than that of China. It does have very serious disputes with China, which China has been exacerbating in recent years. The question, I think, is really, what does India see as being in its interests in dealing with China? How does India work better with countries in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and then in this new framework with the United States, with Japan, and with Australia, to try to balance China's very aggressive activities in the Indo-Pacific region? So I think we have a good foundation for a stronger U.S.-India partnership, but there'll be many areas where we disagree. For instance, India continues to buy major armaments from Russia, like the S-400 system, and the Biden administration will likely not sanction India, even though it has imposed sanctions on Turkey. Very important distinction. On the other hand, India is buying enormous amounts of oil and natural gas from Russia, despite US and EU efforts to try to persuade India to no longer purchase that and further punish Russia's economy. And India has very good relations with Iran, which may become one of the most difficult challenges in the next several years, and so is not really assisting the US in that regard. So it'll adopt a very independent foreign policy where India's government feels that's how it advances its interests, and where it works with the United States to advance common interests, it will do so. It's going to be a very challenging issue, but it's not going to be, quote unquote, following America's commands. That's not India, nor will it be anytime in the near future.
Πριν από λίγες ημέρες είχαμε τη Σύνοδο Κορυφής στο Βίλνιους της Λιθουανίας. Η Λιθουανία είναι μια χώρα, μια βαλτική χώρα, από τις τελευταίες που μπήκαν στην περιοχή στο ΝΑΤΟ, αδύναμες χώρες και οι τρεις χώρες της Βαλτικής, με ισχυρή ρωσική μειονότητα, στη Λετωνία και στην Εστονία αγγίζει το 30%, χωρίς δικές τους δυνατότητες να αμυνθούν. Άρα το ΝΑΤΟ είναι μια καταφυγή για αυτές τις χώρες. Εκεί λοιπόν είχαμε μια πολύ σημαντική Σύνοδο Κορυφής. Και θεωρείται σημαντική κατά την άποψή μου επειδή με την είσοδο, με την ένταξη της Φινλανδίας και της Σουηδίας το ΝΑΤΟ αποκτά δύο πλεονεκτήματα. Το ένα είναι ότι μετατρέπεται η Βαλτική θάλασσα σε μια ανατοϊκή λίμνη και ισχυροποιείται το ΝΑΤΟ στην Αρκτική, μια περιοχή που θα τη δούμε τον 21ο αιώνα ίσως και να πρωταγωνιστεί όσον αφορά το γεωπολιτικό ανταγωνισμό. Εκεί λοιπόν στην Σύνοδο Κορυφής του Βίλνιους, που μπορούμε να τη χαρακτηρίσουμε ιστορική, είχαμε και την έγκριση των νέων επιχειρησιακών σχεδίων του ΝΑΤΟ με δεδομένες τις νέες απειλές όπως αυτές διαμορφώνονται από τον πόλεμο στην Ουκρανία. Εκεί είδαμε την Τουρκία να προσπαθεί να εκβιάσει το ΝΑΤΟ, ενώ υπάρχει μια τόσο κρίσιμη σύνοδος και άνοιξε μια σειρά από θέματα. Καταρχάς, πώς κρίνετε εσείς από τη δική σας πλευρά αυτή τη Σύνοδο Κορυφής στο Βίλνιους, και το δεύτερο σκέλος του ερωτήματός μου είναι πώς είδαν οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής, όχι εσείς προσωπικά όπως το εισπράξατε στην Ουάσιγκτον, πώς είδαν αυτόν τον εκβιασμό από πλευράς της Τουρκίας?
You've raised a number of very important issues that have arisen leading up to, during, and after the NATO summit in Vilnius. First, let me just state, if I might, that Finland is in the NATO alliance. Sweden is not. So Mr. Erdogan seemed to indicate that Turkey would lift its veto of Sweden's accession. President Biden then offered President Erdogan, the press event, thanked him publicly before the entire world, and said, "Thank you, President Erdogan, for your leadership." All wonderful gifts to President Erdogan, especially for the voters that just brought him back into power. And then after the NATO summit was over, Erdogan said, well, we're not going to decide the Sweden issue until October. So he gave Sweden and then took half of it back. Brilliant diplomacy by Erdogan, very crafty, very cunning, and President Biden and the NATO leaders should have done a more secure job of confirming that Turkey will not block Sweden's accession. I hope it takes place, but I'm not sure. We don't know today, and it's only July. So this is an example of the kind of manipulation of the NATO alliance that I think Erdogan has been very successful at. He secured a number of objectives, especially regarding quote-unquote Kurdish terrorism that's being supported by Sweden, and a number of other issues that are very important for Erdogan, and put himself in the middle of world leadership in a way that far transcends his actual stature inside of Turkey. On a larger scale, I don't know if this will be seen as a historic summit as much as one that is very uncertain in its objectives, because, and we saw this with the response of Western leaders to Ukrainian President Zelensky's very angry responses to the denial of any immediate membership in NATO. First of all, Ukraine is in no position to join the NATO alliance today or anytime in the near future. That is more of a very hopeful political message. But Ukraine doesn't come anywhere near meeting the standards of being able to join the NATO alliance. And as President Biden has correctly said, if Ukraine were to join NATO tomorrow or in 6 months, that means that NATO is at war with Russia. And NATO is in no position to go to war with Russia, nor, I believe, does Russia want to go to war with NATO. Russia wants Ukraine to be neutral. And so when you had the Baltic countries that came into the NATO alliance, that was not seen as a strategic threat to Moscow or to Russia's nuclear deterrent. But Ukraine has been a red line issue for Russia for 20 years. And even the current CIA director, William Burns, when he was ambassador to Moscow in 2008, about 15 years ago, he wrote to the administration in Washington, this is a red line not just for Putin, but all of the oligarchs, all of the elite, and all of the Russian people. And I'm afraid that we did not take Putin's threats very seriously. And now we have a catastrophe, the destruction of Ukraine's economy. About a quarter of its population is now refugees. It will cost $250 billion, maybe $500 billion, to rebuild Ukraine. And it's been completely destroyed as a functioning nation state. And I don't see how it is able to gain back Crimea or eastern Ukraine. So we have to be very serious about what kind of promises and offers of assistance the U.S. and NATO can provide to Ukraine. And to your last point, yes, the Arctic Ocean is going to become probably the next strategic theater of competition, not only between Russia and the West, but also China, which sees the opportunity to speed up shipping from its ports in the East Asian Sea to Northern European ports about 1/3 faster than right now going through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean. So I think you're going to see a strategic competition in the decades ahead, especially if the waters remain warmer in the Arctic between the West, Russia, and China in ways that most analysts have not really detected to this day.
Κύριε Συτιλίδη, αυτός ο πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία δεν ξεκίνησε μια μέρα έτσι ξαφνικά. Η κρίση ξεκίνησε το 2008 στο Βουκουρέστι με την απόφαση του ΝΑΤΟ καταρχάς να δηλώσει ότι θέλει να εντάξει στη συμμαχία την Ουκρανία και την Γεωργία, και στη συνέχεια είχαμε τα γεγονότα του Μεϊντάν του 2014, τις συμφωνίες του Μίνσκ, την παραβίαση των συμφωνιών του Μίνσκ και τελικώς ο πόλεμος. Από τη στιγμή που έχουμε την υπογραφή της συμφωνίας Όκους, Αυστραλία, Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο και Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής, που αυτό δείχνει ότι η στρατηγική προτεραιότητα των ΗΠΑ είναι εκεί, Ινδικός, Ειρηνικός ωκεανός, Κίνα. Πόσο έξυπνο είναι να ξεσπάσει ένας πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία, να πάρουμε τη Ρωσία ως εχθρό και να την αναγκάσουμε να πέσει στην αγκαλιά της Κίνας. Δηλαδή, αν αύριο αναγκαστούν οι ΗΠΑ να αντιμετωπίσουν την Κίνα, δεν θα είναι από χειρότερη θέση οι ΗΠΑ να την αντιμετωπίσουν όταν θα έχει δίπλα της τη Ρωσία? Γιατί μπορεί η Ρωσία να έχει πολλές αδυναμίες, όμως γνωρίζετε ότι στον τομέα της αεροδιαστημικής και στην πυραυλική τεχνολογία είναι πολύ μπροστά, πιο μπροστά από την Κίνα, και ίσως είναι πολύ κοντά στις ΗΠΑ. Αυτό, αν έχουμε κάποια στιγμή μια μεγάλη σύγκρουση ή κρίση με την Κίνα, θα ισχυροποιήσει την πλευρά της Κίνας και θα αποδυναμώσει τις ΗΠΑ. Τι λογαριασμός έγινε, πιστεύετε, στα μυαλά αυτών που χαράσουν τη στρατηγική στην Ουάσιγκτον? Δεν βγαίνει αυτή η εξίσωση, οδηγεί στο άπειρο.
So let's just be clear from the outset here, Savas, that there are no geniuses that are able to solve all of the many challenges that we face around the world. And the U.S. does have the great responsibility of, I would say very frankly, leading the West. Our European allies, our democratic allies in Asia, and they see us as a leader, but we don't have every answer immediately available. There are great challenges ahead, and there are no perfect solutions. There are simply trade-offs. So going back to the Obama administration, the U.S. foreign policy establishment has recognized that with the rise of China as a belligerent and aggressive and potentially hostile adversary in Asia, we need to really shift much of our focus away from counterterrorism, right, after Afghanistan and Iraq, towards the rise of China. But our European alliance is very, very important to the United States. And as we see now, there are still crises that emerge in Europe. So I don't think we can have a 100% pivot to one part of the world and abandon the other. The question is, how do we balance what needs to be a greater distribution of forces and resources and assets to the Indo-Pacific region while maintaining the security umbrella for our European allies? And that's going to be the great challenge for many years to come. And we have a very healthy debate about this in Washington right now. There are some who say that we should leave Europe to defend itself. The European Union has a great amount of wealth. It is simply not devoting the resources necessary to defense that, say, the U.S. is. And Presidents Obama and President Trump and President Biden have all complained to many European countries at least the 2% threshold to provide a serious defense. If you want the United States to defend you, are you becoming colonies of the United States? Or can Europe ever certainly and securely defend itself? That's going to be a great issue. But by the same token, we do have to move forces and assets and resources to the Indo-Pacific, because I think the goal here, Savas, is to deter and dissuade China from invading Taiwan, from possibly challenging Japan, from taking over the entire South China Sea and threatening free and open shipping lanes and international law in the South China Sea, or maybe even triggering another war with India, which would be calamitous for the Asian continent. So this is going to be a very serious challenge, and my fear is that, as you correctly note, we need to find ways, it won't be anytime soon because we've destroyed our relationship, our potential relationship with Moscow for the near term. But perhaps in a post-Putin environment, and I'm not confident we're not going to have somebody who's a more difficult leader than Putin, a butcher perhaps, not a Belgian diplomat. I mean, we think that it's going to be better after Putin. Why? History shows that these are tough leaders in Russia always. But maybe the greatest violation of great power balance in geopolitics is to ensure that Russia and China are never closer to each other than they are to the United States. And we're violating it right now with your comment, accurately, that we're pushing Russia into China's embrace, and China will hold on to Russia as tightly as it can. Cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap coal, cheap food, cheap fertilizers, all the things that China needs to import, and that it can try to set up a separate supply line away from dependence on the U.S. So I'm concerned that we're thinking very short term, but we're not thinking long term, and that we may regret in 2030 or 2035 or 2040, for the sake of the Ukraine war, surrendering Russia into partnership with China that will be enormously damaging to Western interests.